Well, hello and welcome everybody. My name is Najwan Al-Junaid and I am the Director of the Business Renewable Center Canada. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you for coming. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we live in a special place, the traditional territories of the peoples of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. And can we have the next slide, please? It is the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot First Nation tribes of Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nation tribes of Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley. And Mohikenstis, which is our Calgary today, is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and Métis Nation of Alberta in Region 3. And truth and reconciliation has been an important topic of conversation for us here at BRC-Canada. It is important to acknowledge that much of Canada's energy industry has been developed with zero input from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. So we continue to listen and we continue to learn about what all this means for BRC Canada and for the work we do. So it has been a learning journey for us. So today, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I invite you all to consider what Indigenous inclusion means to you and how might Indigenous equity show up in your journey and possibly in the contracts you're exploring to source your electricity from renewable energy. Next, I'm going to go through the agenda for today. So I'm going to do a quick overview of BRC Canada and what we are and what we do and why, followed by a presentation from Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon on, she will provide an overview on renewable energy procurement and why Alberta has been an amazing place for this. Following that, we will have a Q&A period with Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon and Mark Porter will also join. And then we will end with a breakout session. We will have the main aggregation discussion here in the main session, and we'll have 2 breakout sessions, and I will tell you more about it later. Quick housekeeping, if you have any technical issues, please throw your questions and issues in the chat. Someone will help you. And if you're attending the aggregation, again, please remain in the main room. The networking will be in 2 other breakouts. Next, please. Special thanks to our sponsors, EDF Renewables and RES. They are both our main sponsors for the 2022 events. And RES is an independent renewable energy company working in wind and solar, as well as energy storage, transmission, and distribution. EDF Renewables is focused on utilities, commercial, and industrial procurement of renewables. And both companies actually sit on BRC Canada's advisory board, and we're always grateful to the support of our board. In fact, I want to acknowledge we also have 5 board members with us today. So Rosalind McMahon from Blue Earth, and Rosalind will be facilitating one of the breakouts today. Jeff Pegg from TELUS, and Stephen Cookson from RES. Dale Ronsky from Capital Power, and Gary Cook from the City of Edmonton. So thank you for coming. Okay, next, please. So why BRC? So really our raison d'être here, this is about grid decarbonization. And we do this through accelerating large-scale renewable energy use across Canada. We are about education and raising awareness in this industry and about the ecosystem that's evolving really fast. We're also focused on building a strong community and supporting that community. And we do this through creating tools and services. More specifically, next, please. We have public resources on our website, so you can find public sessions, online primers. We have a buyers boot camp, and this is open to buyers interested to get to know the details and more information on how to go through a PPA process. There are recordings from previous webinars, like what is a PPA, what is an environmental attribute, and why Alberta is a great place to do this. So this is the public resource that we have on the website. If you join us and you're part of the community, next please. There is a portal with primers, case studies, and templates. We have a monthly newsletter with market news and insights, networking opportunities, and webinars. And we have an enhanced deal tracker where you get to get more details. We have a buyer's roadmap, and this is a step-by-step guide to walk you and help you through the transaction. PPAs, they are a complex transaction. It takes an internal team, it takes internal support. So we walk you through this 11-step process with the support of templates and primers and more details. So this is available in our portal. Next, please. And I am honestly thrilled to have to be working with this community. We have two levels of membership and community here. We have the gold and silver, and it's just been amazing getting to know everybody and just the way they support BRC. And you can see from the diversity of the organizations that there are more and more companies and organizations looking to sign a PPA. And this is reflected in our membership. Next, please. There are three types of membership here. We have buyers, developers, and intermediaries. So you can learn more on our website. We are exploring adding a fourth type of membership, a non-for-profit level. And this is to reduce barriers and enhance accessibility to BRC. So if this is of interest, please email us. Next, please. Upcoming events, we will be at Globe. So we will hold a buyer's breakfast in conjunction of Globe. It will be at the glorious hour of 7 a.m. So join us on March 30th, just before the session start. We will also have a buyer's boot camp early April, and this will walk us through the PPA details and more of the technical needs for a PPA. So this is early April. We will also have a buyer's breakfast in Toronto on June 10th, and we have a members only event in Stampede, a happy hour. It'll be great to see everybody. So more details and upcoming events, even in the fall, will be on our website. Okay, so I am thrilled to introduce our speakers today, Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Calgary. She is the director of the Sustainable Energy Development Program as well, which I'm a graduate of, so it is really a full circle eventually. Like Dr. Hastings-Simon is a longtime supporter of BRC-Canada. In fact, she is the founding director, and we are just thrilled to have her support and time and to be here today. We also have Mark Porter, and he is the Vice President of Programs at the Clean Energy Buyers Association, CEBA. This is our sister organization in the US, and he supports CEBA's programs to really advance PPAs in the US, a very mature market compared to the Canadian market. Mark is a wealth of knowledge, and I'm just grateful to have him here today. And really at BRC, he sits on our board. So welcome, really welcome to both of you. Thank you for doing this today. So without further ado, I will pass the baton to Dr. Hastings-Simon, and I will come back later for questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's fun to be back here virtually. I look forward to the next BRC in-person event, as I'm sure everybody does. So Najwan asked me to spend some time today giving a bit of an overview of renewable energy procurement, what that means, what it looks like, what are some considerations around environmental attributes, as well as where we see the market today and what we can learn from the both recent history in Alberta and Canada, as well as what we see in the US. So I'll start off with, just answering the question, what is a PPA or a virtual PPA, sometimes called VPPA? So on its basis, on the next slide, we'll see it, essentially it's a agreement, a power purchase agreement, where there is a fixed price established that a buyer will pay for every megawatt hour of energy produced. So out of a new renewable energy generation facility within a market-based system like we have in Alberta, the price received for power generated will vary depending on the market price. And what the PPA or VPPA does is establish this fixed price that the buyer is paying. So locking in a fixed price. In exchange for that price, the buyer is going to get the renewable energy certificates or other types of environmental attributes for each of the megawatt hour produced, and really be responsible for the difference between the market price and that fixed price. And this is, what really I think it takes to have the kind of power purchase agreement that we're talking about is a long-term contract. And so that's, something in the range of 12 to 20 years. And this is where the power purchase agreement really allows the buyer's credit to unlock new development in renewable energy, which is obviously a big part of what we need in order to decarbonize the grid. But by entering into this long-term agreement, you have developers that are able to use that, that credit to basically as a low-cost source of capital, and that translates into lower renewable energy prices as well. So that's the kind of overarching idea. On this slide here, you see the flows of all of the different electricity, environmental attributes, and the different prices that come in. When we talk about a virtual power purchase agreement versus a power purchase agreement, the big difference is in who has ownership of the electricity. And so when we talk about a virtual power purchase agreement, that means that the buyer never actually takes official ownership of the electricity, that is all managed between the renewable energy project developer and the market operator, which in Alberta, as folks know, is AESO, the Alberta Electricity System Operator that runs the market. So the virtual piece just means that power never actually officially changes hands, and that keeps the non-utility buyer from having to register and become a market participant. Of course, if we do have cases where buyers may be already involved in the energy market, and so they may actually take direct ownership of that electricity, and it becomes no longer virtual. But I would say that's more the exception than the rule. So when we talk about PPAs, you may even hear often people will just say PPA when they really mean VPPA. So just something to kind of look out for. A couple other things I want to draw your attention to on this slide here. As I mentioned, you have the flow of electricity shown in the darker orange here, and you see that the non-utility buyer, so the buyer the purchaser of the VPPA, still gets electricity delivered in the same way that they do today from the utility. So you still have an agreement with the utility who is responsible for bringing electricity from the market, from the grid to your site. And you are still paying for that electricity in this line that goes over the top. So that's sort of the top piece of this, where you have the electrical utility, the non-utility buyer, electricity flows to them and they pay for that. That would be your starting point today, and that remains the same. And when we talk about adding on a VPPA, we're adding all those pieces below that electricity line. And so what that means is that this fixed contract price, one of the arrows, I wish I had a pointer here, but it's coming from the non-utility buyer to the energy project, that is that fixed contract price. And in exchange, the non-utility buyer is getting the market price. And obviously, since they're also paying the market price, essentially at the end of the day, you have, what is like a swap contract. You're basically responsible as the buyer for that difference in price. So if the market price for electricity is higher than your fixed contract price, then you're actually going to be seeing a positive flow of positive cash flow from this contract. If, however, the price of electricity is low and is below the fixed contract price, then there's going to be a cost, and that flows to the renewable energy project. So another way to think of it is essentially as creating a hedge. You're locking in a given price and assuming that you are using that electricity, essentially when it's generated. Then that's going to function really directly as a hedge. The one other piece here, and we'll talk about that more in a moment, is this flow of the environmental attributes, which is a big, other motivation for entering into a VPPA. So why might one want to enter into a virtual power purchase agreement? I think one thing to note is that different buyers will have different motivations for doing so. And typically buyers will have more than one objective that they're trying to achieve. And the relative importance of those, whether it's more on the environmental side or more on the cost side or hedging and sort of energy management side, really depends on the nature of your organization. But when you enter into a VPPA, you do get that environmental attribute. So that can come in the form of renewable energy certificates or carbon credits. And so you have there's a positive environmental, a positive carbon impact, or a negative carbon impact, I guess, of entering into a VPPA. So, of course, it is possible to directly purchase renewable energy certificates or other mechanisms to procure renewable energy. And one of the big differences when we talk about a VPPA is this question of additionality. So being able to really draw a direct line from the action that a buyer is taking to enter into this contract and the creation of a new renewable energy source, or the addition of a new renewable energy source to the grid. And so that's one of the things that VPPAs offer over, say, just direct purchase of unbundled renewable energy certificates, is that more direct impact on the electricity grid. In addition, as I mentioned before, depending on where the price of electricity goes, there's also the potential that a VPPA actually generates a positive cash flow for a buyer. So, in an environment with rising electricity prices, as we have seen in recent months in Alberta, with a combination of factors coming together, many of the VPPAs that exist, and I'll give the one example of the government one that we have later, are actually in the money. And so, it can either be, as I was mentioning before, a price hedge, or at least or potentially a source of revenue. And then the final thing that, when we think about compared to some of the other options, a VPPA does offer more operational flexibility. So because there is this virtual agreement, and we're not talking about putting infrastructure, say solar panels on the rooftop or things like that, there's a lot more flexibility for buyers to enter into these kinds of agreements compared with some of the other options. So, again, there's not, I think when it comes to renewable energy procurement, there is no one right answer for buyers, and even an individual buyer may go on, somewhat of a journey and start, say, with procurement of renewable energy certificates as part of a process towards entering into a VPPA. But we do see the VPPA is offering a lot of benefits compared with other options. So looks like we have a question about the carbon credits, which is great because that leads right into the next section that I wanted to talk about with environmental attributes. So I hope that I'll also be able to answer this question here. So when we talk about entering into a PPA, we talk about environmental attributes. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on what those are and what happens to them and how they are part of the PPA story. And so when we talk about environmental attributes, on the next slide, you see there's really two main types or almost flavors. They both sort of represent the renewable energy generation and the positive impact that has on the environment. And there's actually two different canonical ways to represent that. One is through renewable energy certificates, which is really a certificate or a sort of a tracking device that basically says this megawatt hour of generation was produced by renewable energy, and therefore obviously has different benefits associated with that renewable energy, some amount of carbon reduction, obviously also, other benefits that come along with renewable generation, such as a reduction in air pollution and potentially generation of positive cash flows for landowners and municipalities that are hosting renewable energy. But it's really about the renewableness of your electricity as a property, rather than going into the details of exactly how that environmental impact looks. And it's something that is created and validated and tracked and managed by third parties. As I mentioned, it is possible to purchase renewable energy certificates outside of a power purchase agreement that are, these tracked certificates. There is a long history, I think, of renewable energy certificates coming out of the involuntary or the compliance market, right? So this is really a mechanism that was created in the US for utilities to comply with renewable energy targets that were set at a state level, for example. And so this is something that came out of the regulatory space, but that has been picked up within the voluntary space as well. So the other flavor of environmental attributes is carbon offsets. And interestingly, I think this is a little bit, here in Canada and especially in Alberta, where we've had a price on carbon for quite a long time, we have a slightly different relationship maybe with carbon offsets than some of the US markets do, and that might influence what buyers are looking for. So unlike a renewable energy certificate, a carbon offset is really focused specifically on the carbon value or the carbon reduction through some kind of activity. And so in this case, the activity is the production of a megawatt hour of electricity, which displaces a megawatt hour of electricity generation from some other source. And so if you look right now within the Alberta electricity grid, you're going to be displacing either a megawatt hour of generation of coal or natural gas, typically simple cycle. And so that's obviously has much higher carbon emissions than your megawatt hour generated by wind or solar. And so the carbon offset really tracks that difference. Now, the actual carbon offset value, of course, varies from hour to hour. In practice, however, the conversion rate for the generation of these offsets is based on a yearly average that's calculated. And there's actually, to make things further complicated in Alberta, there's actually two ways in which you can generate those carbon offsets. So one is through a true offset calculation where the offset protocol basically tries to approximate that displacement. The second is underneath the OBPS, the carbon pricing system that we have in place, where an emissions performance credit can be directly granted, and that's related more to the credits that are given under that system. So right now, the offset protocol has a higher value. Now, those carbon offsets, again, can be used in different ways. And so, as I mentioned, in the states where you had renewable energy targets, the renewable energy certificates can either be used by a company looking to power itself by renewable energy, in which case they would retire or basically take that certificate, put it in a drawer and lock it up. Or they can use that certificate towards compliance, or they can sell it to someone who needs to use it towards compliance. Now, once the certificate or the offset is used towards compliance, then it's no longer possible to make a claim about that electricity. So if a buyer purchases renewable energy, enters into a PPA, and therefore gets either RECs or carbon offset, they then have a second choice, which is, do I want to hold on to and retire that environmental attributes, or do I want to monetize it either directly for my own compliance obligations or sell it to somebody else who then, uses it for their compliance obligations? Again, both are valid approaches to take depending on what a buyer is trying to optimize. The key is really what you can say about what you're doing as a buyer. So if you're holding on to that renewable energy certificate or that carbon offset, then you can make claims about being powered by renewables or about reducing carbon emissions. If you sell or use that offset for compliance, then that is not, you no longer have ownership of that. So it would be incorrect to say that you're being powered by renewable energy. And so that, coming back to this question that we had about how an energy provider can sell carbon credits if it's not sold through the PPA, this is where that additionality is really able to be claimed. So because a buyer, enables the renewable energy project to be generated, but actually also takes those offsets and keeps them potentially from being sold or monetized, that's where that renewable additionality comes. So maybe I'll stop there. I see a lot of questions and we can, I hope, come back to them. But just a couple of things other things I wanted to touch on before we wrap up. So we have been talking about VPPAs, and I wanted to just give a quick overview of other procurement options. So there's a few different ones shown on the next slide. As I mentioned, there is not one right answer, and it's going to depend on what a company is looking for or an organization is looking for and where they are in their renewable energy journey. Certainly on-site solar, so the idea of putting renewable energy directly on a site or on a rooftop, for example, is another way to procure renewable energy. As I mentioned, there's also the potential to purchase RECs or carbon offsets directly, so-called unbundled, meaning that they're not coming with the purchase of the electricity. And this is, again, I think we often see companies that start, perhaps organizations that start their journey there, and then look for ways to increase additionality. And green tariffs would be going to a utility and actually asking them to procure renewable energy on behalf of the buyer. And so that's another option. In Alberta, because we do have the ability to transact with PPAs, that is, that's not available everywhere. And so in some places, a green tariff is really the only way that a buyer can purchase renewable energy. So just before I wrap up, a couple of things to share from where we are in the market. We have a picture of the VPPAs within Canada, which really to date means mostly within Alberta. So you see that, before 2019, we had a very small amount. In 2019, we saw the first real kind of bigger chunk of PPAs coming through being signed. And that's really just took off in 2021. And so this is what actually, I should say what you see here on the graph is for each year, each piece of the bar represents a PPA that was signed. The yellow bars are solar and the blue bars are wind, and the height of the bar is the size of the deal itself. And so what we see happening in Alberta is something that I think really mirrors what happened within the PPA market in the US, which is that after a start and a number of smaller deals being signed, there has been an increase in both number of deals and also in the size. So buyers are purchasing larger, entering into contracts for larger projects, larger wind farms, larger solar. We also see an increasing diversity of sectors. So a number of different types of buyers are coming in. And that is, all those things together are really driving this growth. So I think we saw the beginnings of the start of the market taking off in 2019 and 2020. I think it's obviously, very exciting despite a lot of the challenges that there have been, operating through a pandemic, to see buyers and sellers coming together and starting to see these projects being signed. And ultimately these projects signed means that steel is going into the ground and jobs are being created in Alberta. So when I mentioned before different reasons that that companies may want to enter into PPAs, I think it's also worth noting it is another way for an organization to really invest in the local economy where they are operating, and invest in the province where they are operating through this kind of deal. So I'll just wrap up with one example. This is a picture of the sort of the results for the renewable electricity program that the province of Alberta entered into. And this is interesting because obviously we have relatively good information about the prices. This does include a few different contracts, so there is a little bit of uncertainty around exactly the energy value and contract price matchup, but the range was relatively small. Obviously, many of the deals that you saw signed on the previous page, those are commercial deals, and so the details of those prices are not clear. And so these are deals that were signed under the renewable electricity program that the previous Alberta government brought in. And that looked very much like a PPA. I think the price here, one thing to keep in mind, these were very long-term contracts, government-backed contracts. So this is, there's different things that impact this price. Shorter term would make it more expensive. But what I think is interesting to see here is that if we look at how these how the wind farms that sit behind these deals have operated, what we see is that over the period from September 2019, and I think this is up to date to mid-February, the contract cost, so that fixed price applied to the number of megawatt hours generated at $37, has been far surpassed by the value that the government of Alberta has gotten out of those contracts. So the energy value alone, just the market price value, is over $38. And then of course there is the carbon offset value as well, which for the government of Alberta, they are paying essentially through the carbon price a real carbon offset value. But it gives you a picture of sort of where this can be, at least. Again, of course, were electricity prices to fall, that energy value bar would get smaller. So it's certainly not a guarantee around the price of future contracts, but I think it is a really interesting snapshot about where we're at when it comes to the kind of the economics behind these projects. So maybe I'll wrap up there. I saw a lot of questions coming through, and I think Mark managed to answer some of them, but I'm sure there's a lot more for discussion as we take some time for Q&A.
Thank you, Mark, for jumping in. I guess not all heroes wear capes, so thank you for that. I can kick off. Actually, there's a question around grid capacity, Sarah. It's coming from Pierre Koning. So it is really, as more and more renewable projects come online, grid access conceivably reaching limits. Could we be seeing a situation where the VPPA market dries up while the grid infrastructure catches up? Any sense of the pace at which this opportunity window may be closing and the lag to when it may later open up? So it is really around buyer's risk.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, in a sense, it's a moving target, right? Because the system operator in their transmission planning is really supposed to be looking at what is the future growth of renewables. And the AESO has, over the past couple of years, really recognized these kind of PPAs as a driver of growth. So, functioning well, I would say you would never get to the point where the market would totally dry up and there was no grid connection. That said, I think it is common for there to be some kind of chunkiness to the market. And so, certainly looking at that graph of growth, we are entering into a period where demand is increasing. So I think that there is you know, that if anything, the window is going more in the closing direction. But you know, what one would really have to get into a lot more details around where that potential is to kind of say, you know, I don't think that there is a risk of completely shutting off that market, but I think what you are going to see is potentially, you know, prices may increase as demand goes up, of course, and we look at that supply demand balance, and we've seen some of that happening in the US. So I think that's one of the factors that may come into play. And just in general, sort of, you know, as a buyer thinking about where they want to be, you know, I think we've passed, I would characterize it as we've passed the period where it's really the early movers, and now we're sort of into the core of the market. And so, you know, if buyers are targeting sort of being in that space versus being more on the lagging side, then I would say now is more the time for that.
Okay. And Mark, feel free to jump in if you would like to add anything, and not to pick on you.
Thank you. No, I don't know that I can offer anything more than Sarah volunteered there. You know, the only other thing to think about is that this is also a national market. You know, there are other provinces here that if Alberta needs to go through a period of transmission infrastructure build out to open up new areas of supply to meet growing demand, from a buyer's perspective, the load in Canada can be met from generation in Canada, based on how the environmental attribute certificates work. And so you know, not forgetting the other provinces out there which have different challenges for sure.
No, thank you. I have a question here. Like, I'm going to ask some questions from the chat, and we received a lot of questions in advance. So I'll try to cover some from both. Abbas Badami is asking, how much PPA capacity do you anticipate by 2030? And if you can give a split between wind and power. So if you have a crystal ball, what is the anticipation there?
Mark, do you have a
random numbers?
So in terms of kind of how much capacity, I don't know that I haven't got a crystal ball very handy. You know, I think that what I can talk a little more about is what we're seeing on the technology side of things. And I mean, actually, maybe if we can move the slide back to the deal chart, a couple slides back, that might be really helpful. You know, you can see the rise of solar coming through, and you can see how that is now really kind of competing hard with wind for kind of, you know, buyer interest. So I would expect that trend to continue. I think I personally feel the role for wind is still strong. And you know, that's not going to go away anytime soon. You know, and I think we're going to continue, in my mind, continue and probably see more where the modularity of solar really plays into individual buyers' needs, both locational and size. But, you know, but there's still a large amount of industries in Alberta and in Canada, honestly, who need large volumes of power. You know, wind is going to be able to bring that at scale, and that's really what a lot of these contract mechanisms are really trying to design to do, and then help shift the bulk power system, or to decarbonize the bulk power system as fast as possible. Solar can clearly be a strong ally and advocate and strong tool in that toolkit. I seem to recall in the US last year, I think we had about 60-40 solar to wind. I seem to recall from seeing it before. I think that it's about the same in Canada, in Alberta. I would imagine it's probably going to continue. I see there's needs and roles for both technologies, and, you know, and small hydro and bio and all the rest of it coming through as well. So yeah, I'll stop there. I don't know if I can give numbers though on where we're going to be in 2030.
Maybe just one context to add too. I think one of the other technology trends I would expect to see by 2030, probably before, is more projects that are matching wind or solar with storage. And I think that's certainly something that's happening when you see the storage PPA, or sorry, the solar PPAs that are being signed in the US. I would say more and more those are almost coming standard with storage. And I think that's also, you know, in Alberta, we have seen that solar projects that are coming onto the market are capturing very high prices because there hasn't been, you know, solar to date, and they're really doing quite well, obviously, in those hot, sunny days. But as soon as you start to get more solar penetration, then the market case for storage becomes more valuable, because you're able to really shift that, you know, that duck curve, if people are familiar with that, out to the wing. So I think that's also something that we may see, and actually links to a question that Donald asked about procuring green attributes on an hourly basis. That also, I think, is something that is, you know, what I see as some of the leaders in the market, like Google and others, starting to go beyond, okay, they've sort of checked the box on, we're going to procure enough renewables to meet our demand on a yearly basis. And now they are starting to think about this hourly matching through both a combination of storage, but also the assets they're using. And I'm sure Mark can say more on that as well too.
Okay, I'm glad you're answering. Oh, sorry. I'm glad you're answering other.
I put my video on to see if I could ask a quick question for the group. This is Erica. I'm at Pattern Energy. We're a developer, and we're getting into the Alberta space, doing all this research, and this presentation was great, Sarah. Thank you so much. But do you guys have advice in how to connect developers with buyers on a bilateral basis? And do you guys see a lot of that in the Alberta markets? We have projects coming online, and I'm spraying the industry. We have a couple of projects, and I've been reaching out to everybody, and I saw your screen with all the buyers. So I was just wondering how you guys suggest we connect during COVID.
Be a BRC-Canada member. Come along to events. There's a networking event, I think, in about 10 minutes.
There you go. Thank you, Mark.
We are members. Pattern is a member.
I know, I'm playing. But yes, but you know, be part of the community, I think, is the quick answer to that, Erica. And you know, and understand, you know, help both understand kind of what the buyers are seeking, so that the projects that you're looking to bring to the market are, you know, a stronger value proposition to them, through, you know, there are convenings like BRC-Canada and others that try to do that. BRC-Canada is just the best. That's all it is.
Yeah, like part of what we strive to do is to really focus on education and raising awareness. So a more educated buyer is a better buyer for the ecosystem, Erica. So that's part of the focus of BRC Canada. So thank you for your question. I'm going to ask a policy related question from the advanced question. What should the federal government be doing to make all of this faster and more consistent across Canada? So this is really more of a jurisdictional expansion question.
If I had a wish list for the federal government, there's a couple of things. I think over the longer term, you know, I'd love to see more interprovincial transmission lines, right? And that's going to allow both more development in the Alberta market and also better, you know, balancing of the resources. So I think that's a role that the feds could play for sure. You know, within individual regions, we've talked obviously focused on Alberta, given the market structure there. It's not a federal issue, but I think that there is a lot of potential to open up a similar market in Saskatchewan, which also has really great renewable energy resources, and really, you know, would just require the government there deciding to, you know, have Sask Power, you know, agree to wheel these types of contracts on their transmission system. So I think that that's something that, you know, if I was advising the government of Saskatchewan, is a real economic development opportunity for that region as well too.
I'm not going to start to wade into the policy conversations, and Sarah can know this eminently better than I ever will. I just want to reflect quickly, Sarah. You brought up the point on how some of the leading companies are now moving into kind of a 24/7 type world, et cetera, bringing on battery storage. And I think it's something that I think is important for everyone to note on the phone. And this is as much a personal opinion as anything else. Is that, you know, I feel that moving, you know, it's all about strategy, right? So, you know, a company like a Google or a Microsoft or whoever, who have, you know, massive data centers that run 24/7 themselves, they've got, you know, large and growing and also somewhat known and stable power requirements. The idea of a 24/7 kind of goal, target, strategy makes complete sense. But I would also argue that that for other companies or other buyers, that doesn't make sense with with a highly variable load, et cetera. So what we're starting to see, and I again personally think we'll continue to see the emergence of, is a small number, probably a handful, count on fingers on one hand type of thing, number of more advanced strategies versus a regular true up on an annual basis kind of strategy. So that's our entry level strategy, true up on an annual basis. I used 100 megawatt hours, I bought 100 megawatt hours worth of RECs, I'm matched off on zero carbon, that's great. If I want to take it to the next level, what I am expecting to emerge is a few different strategic routes or types or approaches. 24/7 is one of them, if that matches a business. Community participation, engagement, et cetera, could be another. And so the reason I mention this and kind of drag us back around here is that not every buyer on this call is sitting on 8 gajillion data centers and all the rest of it. And so I wouldn't want people to come away thinking that's the only route, because I personally do not believe that is the case. There are other routes out there. If you're looking to take it to the next level, it has to be business congruent. And there are strategies that are emerging that companies are already taking on to align with basically their strengths and their stakeholders. So it can definitely be more flexible than just kind of that is the way, that is the path. Yeah. Sorry, Najwa, back to you.
No, I mean, every time I attend these presentations, I feel I'm learning something new, like a lot. So thank you both. We have maybe time for 2 more questions, and I'm having a hard time which question I should be asking, but maybe a question around the load here. So from a carbon reduction perspective, how important is it to have a VPPA approximate to the annual load profile of an institution?
I mean, I think one way to answer that question is it depends a lot based on what the generation profile looks like within Alberta. Or whatever region you're talking about. I think right now we still have a significant amount of thermal generation, obviously, on our system. And so what that means, I mean, it's a big challenge that we have to face, but I think it also means that integrating renewables is easier now than it will ever be in the future. And it is possible to be displacing higher generating assets at essentially every hour of the day in Alberta. So I think right now it's much less important to be thinking about things like storage. That said, we do need to sort of walk and chew gum to be ready for that highly decarbonized grid. But you've maybe hit a little bit on something that bugs me in terms of when conversations about grid decarbonization are very focused on that last 10%, which is more challenging. But we will develop tools and approaches to that when, especially in a place like Alberta, we're really still in this first chunk. So just getting out there, getting these projects signed, getting them built is really having a big impact already.
And thank you. I can come at this from a complementary but different angle. We've not seen, hang on, I know one buyer in the US that used kind of the VPPA as a hedge, as a business case, the business rationale for doing a deal. That was their raison d'etre for why this should be a thing. Most buyers do not think of hedging or hedge value as part of their kind of like rubric for their matrix for kind of is this a good deal or a bad deal. Principally, we find that's because most companies aren't hedging kind of anything. Maybe some hedge FX if they're big multinationals, but hedging is not really done very heavily by most companies, most not all for sure. And as a consequence, the idea that a sustainability practitioner would walk into their CFO's office and say, boss, have I got a hedging project for you, when they don't hedge anything else they do in their business. And now the CFO has been presented with a business case to hedge what is probably, not the top 1 or 2 costs, just doesn't make any sense. They typically don't have the internal systems able to manage that and track that, et cetera, assess and really properly assess the risks. And this is not ubiquitous all bias, just most. And so from a timing perspective, from aligning one's generation to kind of supply through a VPPA contract, does that matter? Well, if you're not using a hedge as the business case for doing a deal, no. But I will say, and this is a big but, you know, as a sustainability practitioner thinking about these transactions, you want to make as much economic sense as you possibly can. So, you know, so you don't end up losing a shirt and you can do more deals. Merci, Sarah. And so one would imagine that a closer alignment or closer alignment to demand supply would be better. But what I would be careful of is using that as the reason for the deal, because typically hedging is not a good reason for a company to do these transactions. There are probably better ways of hedging one's exposure to market price risk than using a VPPA, if that's what even the company wants to do in the first place, which is unusual.
Okay, thank you both. Okay, our last question. So the question is, when do you see cap and trade replacing the tier or provincial air emissions policy? And I'm wondering if you can provide a quick overview of the impact or the effect of tier to the buyers, like how it's actually driving them to manage their carbon risk and so forth.
Sure. So, I mean, I think that, you know, obviously a crystal ball on policy is very hard, but I think we've seen Alberta has consistently, you know, all governments have consistently taken action to keep tier or whatever the corporate carbon or the industrial carbon pricing legislation sort of under Albertan control. So I think it's really unlikely that they are ever going to kind of cede to a federal backstop there. They want to have control over how carbon pricing applies to industry in Alberta. In order to keep that, they of course also will have to increase the carbon price to match the federal schedule of increase, which has been indicated, you know, planning to go to $170. I think it was somebody in the comments was talking about, you know, how to get certainty around that. So, you know, there's, I think, a lot of uncertainty, although that is a stated intention to increase the price. There have been some calls for governments to use different tools like actual sort of guarantees or contracts for the carbon price that could help to lock in that price and provide some market certainty there. But certainly, you know, as the price does rise, I do think that it will have an impact on the market in Alberta because the value of the carbon attribute will become so significant for the, you know, the value of the carbon attribute for its carbon offset value will potentially become significant. Of course, that will also be balanced as the grid itself decarbonizes, then presumably that offset value will decline because basically you're sort of, if you've started to clean up your grid, the impact of adding another megawatt hour of clean generation is smaller than if you have, you know, if you're taking a lot of coal offline. So you have sort of those two tensions of rising price and decreasing carbon impact. You know, where they exactly balance out, I think will depend very much on how quickly those things go.
Good, Mark. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you both. Thank you for the presentation, Sarah. I learned so much. I'm sure everyone feels the same. That was evident in the robust conversation on chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but it's very informing to us. So we can actually design sessions in the future based on these questions as well. Okay, so next slide, please. We will be headed now to the aggregation discussion with Mark Porter. Please stay here. I know we have a number of people from post-secondaries, and I'm so excited that institutions are interested in PPAs. There will be 2 breakout sessions that should come out for those who indicated they're interested in networking and meeting people. We have 2 sessions, one for beginner and one for experienced. The beginner will be with our analyst, Kelvin Nang, and the experienced would be with Rosalind McMahon. Again, she's from Blue Earth. She is a board member. Do we have the breakouts ready? Are people moving into breakouts? Is this how I see it filling up. Good.
See a few people moving now as well.
Yeah. And we have some board members. So if you're interested in going into either room to meet people and represent BRC, feel free to do that. Awesome. I think we can start, Mark. Can we go to the next slide, please, for Mark?
Thank you. And let's flick to the next slide as well, because by now everyone knows who I am. Okay, cool. So we have a best part of 50 people in this room. So it's unlikely to be a huge, big, wide conversation, but keen to just reflect everyone for a second and think about kind of why are you attending this session talking about aggregation? Think about that for 20 seconds and then add your comments into the chat, please, so we can start to get a sense of where everyone is at. And again, if this is not the room you need to be in, because I see a few people going down to about 38 now, then please move over to the other breakout groups. Mark, thank you for leading the charge. It's great. And keen to see about another 30 or so folks add things into chat as well, so we get a good sense of where we are. We would do this orally, but with 30 of us, we'll be here all night, which will be fun, but we've probably got other things we need to do.
Yeah, feel free to jump in. This is really more of a discussion with Mark to answer your questions. It's hard to do the informal chat on Zoom, but we're trying hard.
And so while everyone's thinking why they attended this session, Mark, thanks for the question here. So interested in learning how aggregation can or has been used as a mechanism to enable smaller community scale projects. Yeah, exactly. So let's think. Okay, so there are, I'll take a step back and just maybe paint a picture while I see a few more coming in, which is excellent. The phrase aggregation can encompass a lot of different styles of types of structures of transactions. Okay, so technology doesn't change, et cetera, the market system doesn't change, but how buyers come together as counterparties can look a couple of different. So for example, there are a number of projects have been signed, a number of deals have been signed whereby there's one company comes in as basically an anchor tenant and uses their credit to effectively backstop, materially all of the project, and then a whole raft of other companies come in, or other buyer. I'm going to use the word company and buyer synonymously because I can't get my head out of that, but I'm talking about all buyers, institutional or otherwise. They're able to come step in and take a smaller clip and bite of that project, basically filling up the rest of the available capacity. You sort of a large, big buyer in there that's kind of undertaking the backstop. In that structure, the contract the large buyer signs essentially becomes the template for everybody else. Financiers generally don't want to have to model out hundreds of different contracts. It gets really confusing for them. It's tough for their credit committees to get their head around it, et cetera, et cetera. So the more homogeneity between those contracts, i.e. they need to be the same pretty much, give or take, means it's going to work. Another different approach to this is where multiple buyers come together kind of more in advance, agree on what they're looking for, and then move forward and start to contract with a project or projects kind of together as a collective group, and each take a certain slice of the collective capacity pie. Again, the contracts are going to look pretty similar because to affect or enable efficient financing, then generally we would need to have then generally we need to have a kind of the contract structure look pretty similar to basically reduce risk for the lender. I'm going to quickly look at, so Mark, going back to your question, enable small community scale projects. The question I would have there is what is making the community scale project struggle to get away right now? Because aggregation is not a kind of a panacea for all ills. So if, for example, and Mark, jump in, like, you know, I'm going to keep rambling until somebody yells at me. If, for example, you have a small scale community project that is struggling to attract buyers because the price is too high, perhaps, because you're not capturing economies of scale. If the project is small, then okay, it's not attracting economies of scale because it's small. That's a challenge for it. Well, what benefits is the project bringing to kind of the world, the market, the community? And so, in my mind, the trick then is to think about or find buyers that are interested in really supporting the local energy transition, and they are heavily invested in communities. That's their business model. That's their strategic kind of their USP in the marketplace, if you will, from a stakeholder perspective. And approach those groups with the idea of, with the benefits and values that specific project is going to bring in. And that could be one buyer, it could be many, but not all buyers are necessarily going to want to be kind of in those deals if all they need to do is move hard against their targets, with kind of the lowest cost, et cetera, all the way through. Mark, please chime in as and when you need to. I'm going to look at the next question. Oh,
I've just unmuted myself here. Thanks. That provides pretty much a good coverage of kind of what I was asking around. And I guess maybe just to follow up with that would be just wondering, to my knowledge, we haven't really seen that approach in Alberta yet, where a buyer does look at aggregating several smaller projects. To my knowledge, it's been mostly large scale developments that have gotten the contracts. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on, is it really just finding the right buyer to enable that in Alberta more, or are there other barriers that have yet to be addressed?
Thanks, Mark. It's a really good question. So I think there's, as I just kind of ruminate on this a little bit, there's a few things going on here, right? We, as in a few other markets, the large scale deals, the ones that happen first, typically because you can reach economies of scale, and it's worth investing time on the finance in the company, the legal in the company, the procurement in the company, treasury, et cetera, understanding these deals because they're big and they make material progress towards goals. Equally, on the, say, service provider, consultant, intermediary side, on the project developer side, everyone's learning how these deals come together and be structured. And quite frankly, you need a large deal to cover the higher transaction costs you're going to get when you do that for the first few times. As the market matures, the ecosystem broadens and deepens, one can get a little more creative, because now no one's learning how to do these deals. We've learned that. We're on to kind of the next phase of the market, and kind of echoing a little bit what Sarah was saying, we've seen that pretty serious hockey stick. I would hypothesize or pontificate, if you feel that that's closer to how I'm talking, but pontificate the fact that we're starting to reach that point where you have a broader market ecosystem that's broad and is deep enough that you can start to do some more of this innovation. Doing another PPA is great, or VPPA, sorry, using those two terms interchangeably, is great. But some companies, some buyers, will want to go, okay, we'll want to be like rather than being a market leader, they'll want to be the market leader. And so how can they differentiate themselves? And we will eventually end up in the point where we're saying, well, actually, I've got a whole ton of stakeholders in a certain region, maybe I should look there and see if I can do something locally. Transaction costs are going to be higher, because based on as a percentage of the overall project cost, absolutely. But for some buyers, it's going to be worth it. But I'm not that surprised we haven't seen it yet, because people are still really kind of getting their heads into actually how do these deals work and come together. And all those transactions are pretty new from announcements. So there aren't that many operating projects just yet. Announcing is one thing, hitting financial close, going through construction and reaching COD, and then like living with how the contracts actually execute and perform is another multiple different kettles of fish, as we would say in the old country. Hopefully that's useful. Zach, looking at PPA options to reduce emissions, but our power demand is likely too small. Sure, yeah, no, absolutely, Zach, and you are not alone. So a couple of reflections upon this. Probably, so it's going to be important to know thyself a little bit in order to find some friends to go to dinner with. Things like, what are your goals? Like, how are your goals written? Are you after renewable energy or are you after carbon reduction? And I'll come on to why that's important in a second. What's the timetable on your goals? 2025 or 2050? How generally aggressive is your company from a risk perspective? You know, like rolling the dice, or you might be a little more conservative. Let's think. Where do you have load? May or may not be a factor, but it's worth really understanding, which you probably do understand it fairly intrinsically. And so the reason why I'm kind of quoting some of these things off the top of my head is that finding other buyers with similarly written goals on a similar timeline with a similar risk attitude and potentially in a similar location, or that's probably less important, you're just more likely to be stronger, better partners from the get-go because you're aligned on some of the key areas. What we have seen happen is where, you know, a number of groups have come together because they all happen to live in a certain city, or all the people happen to hang out in the same coffee shop, whatever it is. And that's great. They all get along really, really well and all like, you know, chai tea lattes or whatever. But the challenge there is often that they all have different aims and objectives from the transaction. And so when that group is going through, you know, discussing specific terms and everything else, often what happens is, because of different groups' perspectives, you end up with the most conservative term sheet in the world, because everyone has a sensitivity to a different risk or a different perspective and stance. And so that's where the line gets drawn. And as a consequence, the price goes up because it's really, really conservative and all the risks are being pushed off the buyer. And that usually gets, you know, it makes it difficult for some other companies who are possibly more relaxed on the terms themselves. And so thinking about some of the kind of like more business characteristics or institutional characteristics that you bring will help find, you know, dancing partners of a more equivalent level.
Can I jump in quickly, Mark?
Yeah, please.
So this whole session on aggregation was inspired, honestly, when Donald Jantz, representing the Sustainability Collaborative of the Post-Secondaries, really asking, how do we do this? So maybe, Donald, I'm just wondering if you can come off mic and just give us more context, because I think this is so interesting and so valuable for us to learn. And I think Mark would appreciate that context for the post-secondaries.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Najwa.
Yeah. Sure. Thanks very much again. Thanks for making this session possible. I know that so as the kind of founder of the secondary post-secondary group, it's kind of a not-for-profit that's helping the post-secondaries across Alberta and Saskatchewan to improve the sustainability. And one of the issues they have, you know, we're all looking into energy efficiency, but many of them also have quite ambitious goals to reduce their emissions profiles, you know, both from a community perspective and you know, they want to do the right thing for their students, and it's being demanded by the communities they serve. So there is appetite. I know that just recently one of our post-secondary members has signed a power purchase agreement to reduce their emissions profile. Obviously, our grid is still relatively coal heavy and has natural gas. So there's opportunities to do that. And but often they don't have necessarily the administrative capacity or expertise to manage complex processes. At the same time, you know, there are some post-secondaries who are investing heavily in on-site generation. So Red Deer Polytechnic is one of the ones that's really forging ahead on this, and has and put in place a lot of solar, and has plans to increase that dramatically. And so if they want to do that, one of the options that I don't know if they're actually actively considering, but seems palatable from my perspective, is allowing other post-secondaries potentially to participate in those installations to increase financing, but also to get some expertise to create that ability to internally to participate in these agreements and start to realize, okay, this is manageable. We can do it, this way, particularly if it's internal to kind of the post-secondaries themselves. So I think that's some of the context. We're just trying to explore what's possible. And so I really like the idea, the larger post-secondaries in Alberta can take a more leading role, and often are, and I could see and sometimes have the capacity to do that. They just have so many more resources to act as an anchor for a project. And then the other institutions, the structure would have to be worked out, but smaller institutions then could participate. And what I see as another piece of the benefit, there's economic diversification and growth, and post-secondary students from engineering to communications want to be involved in this industry. So there's, I think, also then potential to have really interesting funding coming into play, and maybe the internal to the process with the developers and whatnot, to give our students exposure across the province, from the technical side to more business side or communications in these projects. So I kind of throwing a lot out there, but those are some of the context and some of the interest and conversations that we're having within the post-secondaries. And so already you've answered a bunch of questions and brought up more questions for us to contemplate. But that's kind of where we're coming from.
Donald, thank you. Donald, thank you also. It sounds like you got a small army of willing folks to help out. They just need a bit of general. Well, and I say that slightly tongue in cheek, but also that I think that's what it feels like. There's a need for here is some leadership is the wrong word, because that's not lacking. More kind of like central coordination. And so what we've seen certainly in the US market, and with many institutions as well, on their own and or kind of working in a cohort, is bringing in intermediaries or kind of consultants to help manage that process through. And I would also argue as well on the legal counsel side as well, because that can be critical. And and Donald, honestly, I think if you're thinking about this as a broader play, the idea that this is signing up to a constant stream of cash flowing out to paying consultants, I think is in my mind is not right. The idea is that we want to learn from those groups and organizations such that there is sufficient skills and resources and knowledge within the kind of collective community of institutions, such that deals 3, 4, and 5, or 5, 6, and 7 or something are much more closely and tightly managed internally. I'd argue having a lawyer looking over these things is always a good idea. And the market moves, so having kind of consultants and intermediaries on board, even if they're not necessarily paying, they're paying more of a secondary, like advisory role rather than a more primary active leading role, is almost always I can't think of a situation where it's not a good idea. But transfer that knowledge from private sector, help them move the cohort through the first few deals, so that folks really understand. Now, having some continuity on the institutional side in terms of staffing and folks on those projects, really important. Building in the knowledge, the access, the kind of learning opportunities for the staff and also students, I think is also key. I'm trying to think that there's a group called Second Nature, works out of the US, that they don't do this just themselves, but I know they've got a number of members, university members, who have done this. I can always connect you with them. I mean, go online and find them easily enough. That would be a group to talk to get connected in with universities that have done this. I happen to know a few of them because I think it's a super interesting kind of area. So happy to connect you as well there. But speak to others that have done this sort of thing, either on their own or in concert. And start small. Honestly, the first deal doesn't have to be a monster, and probably shouldn't be a monster, right? This is a long-term play. You're working for intergenerational, teaching on the next generation of students, etc., etc. start off small, move forward. Advancing on-site projects while we advance off-site projects, in my mind, is a way to kind of balance both, the ability for communities and stakeholders to see, actually see with their own eyes, changes and transitions that are happening, and kind of, money where mouth is, and action, walking the walk, as it were. As well as off-site, which is often a little harder for psychologically many people to get their heads into until they really start reading. But moving those along in concert. And so for an on-site project, it's tougher to get. You can't get economies of scale on the build, on the install, but you can on the panel. You can on the racks. You can on the inverters. Red Deer might need 1,000 panels for their next roof, but Calgary and Banff might need another 500 each. Well, now you got a 2,000 panel order. The start to aggregate some of that in kind of almost like a collective purchasing team there, and work with the developers that have good relationships with the supply chain to be able to bring that in. You don't need all of them at once. You've got 3 or I'm making this up, right? You got a number of projects that are slated to happen between now and the end of 2020X. But put the order in, get some economies of scale, drive that forward. When the first university, the first institution is putting on their roof, make sure that others from the other universities are also present, just to see how it's being done, learn the lessons, get the case studies turned out and pushed out there. On the energy efficiency side, as a sidebar, I recommend looking at the Environmental Defence Fund. Has a really robust kind of suite of resources all about energy efficiency within, just any business, but also institutions. Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, that I also work with, has done a ton around thinking about how to kind of structure energy efficiency contracting, and just how one thinks about the business case behind that. Just as an aside, like learn those lessons, bring those people in, get this, the students involved, as you're going to know eminent, and your peers will know eminently better as to kind of what they want to know. But there are so many angles to these transactions, starting with just procurement. How do you buy this stuff? How do you negotiate it? Like the business side of these things, the legal side of things. As you said, the engineering, the science side of these things. Then there's the comms, the reporting. If a university is going to do a deal, or institution is going to put panels on a roof or a turbine over in a field or something, well, then they want to get credit from that. So who's doing that reporting? GHG inventory work and reporting is a grind, I think, on the best of days. But that to me smells like a great student project, just to see how it works on that side of things, and see the impact that a renewable energy project has on it, etc., etc. I'm going to pause there. I love this stuff. I can go on for hours, but there's hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that's a great help. Thanks very much. No, there's so much information to take in, and lots of ideas there. I hadn't really considered multi-site approach to the aggregation. There's several campuses who are actively pursuing opportunities, and aggregating those in some sense, particularly if you had, I guess, the same developer, you could achieve some cost reductions and then learnings that all post-secondaries could benefit from.
Yeah.
One of the pieces that I'm also thinking about is around financing. So actually putting these things up and finding the funds for it is always a struggle right now in Alberta. Yeah. But there are more creative sources of funding. The Canada Infrastructure Bank, they have huge minimums, and I don't know if they're specifically interested in renewable projects, but there are other sources. So I don't know, your thoughts about financing projects would be?
Yeah, so, and so Don, I'm also going to answer Zach's second question here about credit strength of anchor buyers, other buyers. Would an IG credit typically see better rates or terms? That's a really tough question to answer, really, because probably not better than the rest. You're probably a lender's more likely to think about this on an average across all of the buyers, and so depending on who's bringing what level of contribution or offtake. Are more likely to, you know, it'd be a weighted average, of course, so there'd be more of an average there. And we have seen examples where companies, you know, five or six companies came together and they did a deal. A couple of those companies weren't investment grade, and so, you know, quite frankly, they probably pulled the interest rate up a little bit for everyone else, but it was worth it for those companies coming in because, you know, part of their reason for doing this was to bring other buyers into the mix that would have otherwise struggled. You know, it's part of their story. Don, your thought on finance? I mean, you know, I think working with good developers, that's the kind of often the path of least resistance here, because they know the tech well, they are experts in working with multiple different finance parties to kind of structure these deals. You know, use them as an ally, as a kind of advisor, if you will, in these transactions. That being said, you know, through some of the municipal association that I forget the FMA, no, you know, some of, you know, higher ed institutions can often access low rates of capital, and you might be able to undercut that. Now, a couple of thoughts here. You don't have to be the construction provider. If you're talking to, if some of the chief treasury officers, so some of the institutions, you know, going to get a bit jumpy about taking on construction risk, well, don't take it on. Just be takeout finance at COD post 2 years. And I'm making this up here, but there are ways to move this around such that the long-term cost of finance is more akin to what you're used to seeing, but you're going to use the private sector much more so to kind of get the project up and running and kind of, you know, de-risk it for a year or two. So you see a bunch of seasons going through and you understand the performance. And again, as classic with finance, you know, the larger the ticket of the deal, the more enjoyable run you're going to have. Just your transaction cost, if the deal is really small, transaction cost as a percentage of overall deal cost is going to be really high. And so the lower that ratio, the lower that percentage, the better. So think about whether or not you can aggregate it. You know, can a large developer act more like a warehouse facility, or is there a looking at some of the financial institutions? You know, I saw CIBC background pop up very briefly, but you know, the key lenders in this space, and also look at infrastructure funds, like they have their own goals and targets. You know, they're saying we want to invest X numbers of dollars in certain areas and certain sectors. Does this qualify? Probably does. You know, and one thing I would also caution about is given the scale of projects, you're unlikely to ever reach kind of like the bond threshold, which is usually about $100 million or so, give or take, maybe a little bit less these days, but it's up there. And so, you know, you are talking about more akin to project finance type structures, but you know, look across multiple projects and have somebody else do that aggregation rather than you. You know, a developer that's working on 10 different projects and you have 5 of them, I don't know, that can bring in a larger tranche of capital to make that transaction more efficient. Najwa, I know we're about to roar into time, and I want to be respectful here, but hopefully that's helpful.
No, thank you, Mark. I saw an announcement that we have, like, the breakouts have 5 minutes, so I'm expecting people to come, but I'm seeing that they're still in the breakouts. Like, really, when people come, we'll just wrap up and say a thank you. But you know, if you want to wrap up your thoughts there, Mark or Donald.
Yeah, great. I mean, you know, I think anything with partners is tough, right? But you know, the saying about, you know, you want to go fast, you go alone. You want to go far, you go with friends. That's really what we're talking about. And so I think all of these groups, all of the groups that we've worked with, we've seen happen, and you know, written case studies on, etc., require a couple of humans to run point and you know, cajole people and send out and just do the logistics, sending out calendar invites, keeping agendas up to date, etc. The really unsexy things, but it's kind of essential to move these things forward. And so having a group that can act in that capacity and that is motivated either because they're getting paid or through some other fiduciary duty is going to be really important. I would say to, hey everyone, welcome back. I would say that, come to BRC Canada events, have these sorts of conversations, look at the resources that we have on the platform. They're deliberately written to apply to as many people as possible, so not everything's going to be relevant to you, but there'll be enough in there that it's worth having a read over the next cup of tea, etc., etc. And then also reach out to Calvin, myself, reach out to Najwan, reach out to the board of directors, and with the questions of things we all need to develop. What else? What next is out there that it's going to be useful to help the market keep expanding?
Awesome.
Thank you.
I really meant it when I said that Mark is a wealth of knowledge. This was amazing. Thank you, Mark. I think we can just go to the last slide, please. It's really thank you again to our sponsors who make our events happen and help BRC expand not only in Alberta but beyond. So thank you, DF Renewables and RES. And the final slide, we have our contact information. Please follow us on social media. Please spread the word. I saw a question around sharing. Yes, we have recorded this session, so it will be available on our website in a few days. So keep checking the public resources. Our emails are there. Follow us, stay in touch, join as a member. We would love to build this ecosystem further and further, and it is you who will make it happen once you are part of this conversation. So thank you all. Have a great day. There will be snow coming this way, so more ski for the great skiers of Alberta. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you, Mark, again. Thank you, Donald. Take care.
Thank you, Najwan. Thank you all. Thanks, Calvin.